Young Comanche woman Nima was tied to the rails, her life a bargaining chip in a cruel game for ancient treasures. This monstrous injustice was the work of traitors who cynically used her fate as leverage. But Jedediah Stone, a man with a dead heart, didn't let the darkness swallow an innocent soul and broke the vicious cycle. Find out how this encounter led to a shocking reunion and the uncovering of a secret that turned the whole story on its head. Subscribe and like to see how justice ultimately prevailed. The western prairies stretched to the horizon, scorched by the merciless summer sun. Jedediah Jed Stone, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a face carved from granite, trudged along the steel rails. The sun was setting, painting the sky in fiery, orange tones, but for him, this landscape was devoid of any poetry. After long years in the Union Army, where he had seen too much blood, mud, and senseless death, Jed had lost faith in anything good. He was moving west simply because that was where the country ended, and perhaps where his personal pain ended as well. The rails were his only guide, leading nowhere, just like his life. He heard a dull rumble long before he saw the locomotive. This sound, familiar and menacing, spoke of approaching civilization, which brought with it progress and destruction in equal measure. But soon, another, more subtle and desperate sound mixed with the noise of the locomotive. A scream. Not an animal's, but a human's. Jed quickened his pace. He was walking in a straight line and soon saw her. On the tracks, where steel met wooden ties, a girl lay. Her thin wrists and ankles were tightly bound to the rails with thick ropes. Her long black hair, braided into plaits, was sprawled on the ground. She was a Comanche. It was clear at first glance from her deerskin clothes, decorated with beads, and from her facial features, sharp cheekbones, a straight nose, eyes full of wild, untamed fear. This fear was a terrible sight because she was not screaming, but simply whispering the same word, help. The locomotive was already close, its black silhouette resembling a huge beast rushing through the sunset. A loud and piercing whistle ripped through the silence of the prairies. In that moment, Jed felt something he had long considered lost: compassion. It wasn't just pity for another's life. It was a deep, penetrating sense of injustice that rose from the depths of his soul. Someone so full of life and wild beauty had been left for certain death. His hands clenched into fists. Please. Her voice grew louder, filled with desperation. Save me from these rails, and it'll be yours forever. It was not just a promise, it was a bargain, a desperate, terrible barter of life for freedom.
I ask you to like and subscribe to the channel, so you will help me in motivation to make such great stories for you, and I will see that you like them. Enjoy watching, everyone.
1,000 thoughts flashed in Yed's eyes. Yours. What did that mean to her? What would it mean for him? His life was already full of suffering. But this cry was so sincere, so full of pain, that it pierced his indifference like an arrow. He could no longer stand by. This girl, whom he had never seen, bore the burden of someone else's cruelty, and he, Jedediah Stone, could not bear it. He broke into a run. His old boots thumped heavily on the gravel, each step filled with a determination that had been born in him instantly. He was strong enough to break those ropes, fast enough to make it. He had to make it. The locomotive was so close that Jed could already see sparks flying from beneath the wheels. His heart pounded in his chest like a drum beating the rhythm of his own race against death. Finally, he reached her. Crouching down, his trembling hands grabbed the wooden-handled knife he always carried in his boot. A glimmer of hope, which made his heart ache, flashed in her tear-filled eyes. Don't be afraid, he said. I'll make it. He put all his strength into the movement. The knife barely cut through the thick, coarse rope that was digging into her wrist. The knife was getting dull with every movement, and the locomotive was getting closer, its whistle turning into a continuous, deafening roar. Jed managed to free her hands, then he grabbed her shoulder and pulled her sharply. She couldn't move. The ropes on her ankles were still intact. It won't work, she cried out. It's too thick. The locomotive was only a few feet away from them. Its light blinded Jed, and the gust of air knocked him down. He fell, covering the girl with his body. The engineer saw them and screamed in a panic, trying to brake, but it was too late. It all happened in an instant, a rumble, a screech of metal. Jed felt the ground shake beneath his body, and then nothing. When the deafening noise subsided, Jed realized they were alive. By some miracle, the engineer had managed to slow the train, and it stopped just an inch from them. The terror slowly receded, giving way to pain. She lay in his arms, her thin body trembling. At that moment, he felt the full weight of her existence, not just as a victim, but as a broken life. And his heart ached not from physical pain, but from the pain he saw in her eyes, from the pain that made her make that terrible offer. He understood that her words, "I'll be yours forever," were not just a promise, but a desperate attempt to exchange herself for freedom. It was a cry from a soul mutilated by the cruelty of this world, and Jed was the only one who heard that cry. He didn't know who did it, but he already felt a growing anger that was getting stronger, displacing his former indifference. He had to protect her, even if it meant he had to face all the injustice of this wild and ruthless world. The rescue brought no relief, but only deepened the pain. Jed pulled Nima, as the girl was called, from under the train wheels. Her thin body was still trembling from the terror she had endured, and her eyes, which had just been shining with hope, now held an abyssal emptiness. He carried her away from the tracks, to where the grass was drier and softer. The locomotive, which had stopped just a few feet from them, gave a sharp blast of its horn, and the huge black train slowly moved on, leaving them in the silence to their trauma. Against the backdrop of the setting sun, its wheels seemed like a symbol of the relentless, ruthless world that had almost swallowed Nima. Jed checked her wrists and ankles. The ropes had left deep, bleeding marks on her delicate skin. He tore his shirt to bandage the wounds, and while he did it, she didn't utter a word. She just looked at him, her gaze so penetrating that he felt exposed. He tried to say something, but the words got stuck in his throat. How could he explain that he saved her not to own her, as she had offered, but simply because he could no longer live, despising himself? How could he explain that her desperate deal hurt him far more than her physical wounds? "Who did this?" he finally asked, his voice sounding hoarse. She just shook her head. "They said I'm needed for ransom. But I know. My father, they thought I was their property." The pain she felt was not just physical. It was the pain of realizing that her own family, her people, might have seen her only as a commodity. This thought echoed with pain in his heart. He had seen a lot in life, but such humiliation and such cruelty, no. It was not just injustice, it was the destruction of a human soul. "I'll be yours, forever," she repeated softly, and there was not a hint of shyness in her voice. There was only a sense of doom. Yet's head snapped up, and he looked her in the eyes. "Nima, listen to me," he said. "I don't want you to be my property. I saved you because I couldn't do otherwise. Because no one should die like that." She continued to look at him, as if not believing him. "But I gave my word. Among my people, a given word is law. It's forever." Her voice was as firm as a stone. And then the full depth of the situation dawned on Jed. It was not just a desperate deal, it was a sacred vow. He saved her, and by doing so, he accepted her vow. He became part of this tragic story, and it seemed that he was now bound to her much more tightly than he could have imagined. He didn't want property, he wanted peace, but instead of peace, he got responsibility. And he understood that this responsibility would be heavier than any burden he had ever carried. "Then," he said, "we must find those who did this. If you are mine, then I must protect my family." He did not say the word property. It was stuck in his throat. He replaced it with family. It was the first word that came to his mind, and it turned out to be the right one. For the first time in a long time, Nima smiled. The smile was so fragile, so sad, that his heart contracted even more. They spent the night by the fire. Jed didn't sleep, watching her as she slept peacefully, curled up like a wild animal. He couldn't understand what was driving him. Was it a conscience that had slept for so long and now woke up with double force? Or was it the secret she kept, which aroused in him an irresistible curiosity? He didn't know. But he knew that his lonely path had ended. Now he had a companion, and not just a companion, but a person whose life he was obligated to protect. In the morning, as the sun was just beginning to rise, he saw footprints on the ground. They were the tracks of boots, not moccasins. The tracks belonged to those who had tied Nima to the rails. And there were many of them. Looking at the tracks, Jed felt anger begin to stir within him. A pure, unrestrained anger. These people didn't just want to kill. They wanted to humiliate, to break a spirit. And now they would pay. They would pay for making him, Jedediah Stone, feel something again. They would pay for making this girl, this vulnerable soul, offer her freedom for her life. And in that moment, his pain turned into determination. He found his new purpose, and that purpose was clearer than ever. He would look for these people, and he would find them. He would not just give her back her freedom, he would give her back her dignity. The tracks led them to an abandoned railroad warehouse a couple of miles from the rails. The dirt and dust covering the boards indicated that the place had not been used for a long time, but the smell of fresh tobacco and cheap whiskey said otherwise. Nima, moving silently like a shadow, grabbed Yet's hand as they got closer. There was no more fear in her eyes, only a focus worthy of an experienced hunter. "There are many of them," she whispered. "We can't just go in." The anger Jed had felt earlier had now solidified into cold, steely resolve. He was a former soldier, and he knew what to do. His years in the army taught him that rage could be dangerous if not channeled properly. "We don't have to fight them," he hissed in response. "We'll just lure them out." Their plan was simple. Nima, knowing the lay of the land, lit a small fire away from the warehouse using dry branches and grass. The smoke that rose into the sky was meant to attract attention. Meanwhile, Jed, clutching his old revolver, hid behind a pile of logs. He figured that the men who had tied Nima to the rails would be foolish enough to go check out what was happening. And they did. 3 men came out of the warehouse. One of them, tall and scrawny, with a reddish mustache, was the very man who, according to Nima, was their leader. His name was Clarence. "We need to check what's over there," he grunted. "Maybe the Indians are coming back for their girl." Clarence's voice was filled with such contempt that Jed felt rage wash over him again. But he kept himself in check. When the men had walked a sufficient distance, Nima, like a ghost, slipped out of her hiding place and quickly made her way to the warehouse. She knew their horses were most likely there. Why? Jed didn't know. But he trusted her. When she returned, she had an old bag in her hands. From it, she pulled out a small leather pouch, similar to those the Comanches wore. "They had this," she said. "I don't know what it is." Jed took the pouch and opened it. Inside, along with a few bits of gold dust, lay an old, yellowed photograph and a Union soldier's dog tag. Jed froze. The photograph showed a man in an officer's uniform, smiling, with kind eyes. The dog tag, engraved on an old piece of metal, bore the name, Lieutenant Henry Ward. Yet's breath caught. He knew this man. Henry Ward had been his commander during the war, a man Jed considered his friend. But more importantly, Henry Ward was a man he thought had died during one of the battles. On that day, when they were ambushed, Jed was wounded and lost consciousness. When he woke up, the entire squad was dead. He never forgot that day. Henry Ward's name was always associated with pain and loss for him. But that was not the whole intrigue. There was something else in the pouch. A piece of parchment rolled into a tube. Jed unrolled it. It was a map. And on this map, a place was marked. A place that was very familiar to Nima. These are the lands of my tribe," she whispered, looking at the map. "But it's not just land. It's a sacred mountain, where our ancestors left their treasures." And then everything fell into place. These people weren't hunting for Nima. They were hunting for treasures. And they thought Nima knew where they were. Her father, the chief of the tribe, had hidden these treasures, and they thought Nima was the key. But what did Henry Ward have to do with all this? Was he alive? If so, why was he involved with such people? And most importantly, why was his dog tag with these bandits? Jed looked at Nima. There was no more sadness in her eyes, only anger mixed with determination. She was not just a victim, but an heiress. The heiress to a great secret that these people were trying to uncover. And they were willing to do anything to get it. "I know what they want," she said. "They want my land, my treasures, but they'll never get them." Her words were full of pride and strength, and Jed realized that she was no longer the frightened girl he had found by the rails. Now she was a warrior, and he was ready to fight by her side. His anger was now directed not just at abstract injustice, but at specific people, at betrayal, at old wounds that had suddenly opened. His own peace was now closely linked to her vengeance. On the horizon, the 3 men appeared. They seemed to have realized they had been tricked. Jed quickly hid the map and the dog tag. "They're coming," he whispered. "Now we'll do things differently." Nima nodded. She knew that this fight was not just for her life. It was a fight for her people, for her honor, for her future. And Jed, standing beside her, felt that he had finally found his path. His personal pain, his fury, and his thirst for justice were now linked to her, and he would fight for her until his last breath. He was ready for it. Just as Jed and Nima stood ready for a fight, something unexpected happened. The men returning to the warehouse stopped and raised their hands. In the twilight, Jed noticed that two riders were standing behind them. One of them, tall, with a noble bearing, was dressed in a worn but clean Union Army officer's uniform. His face was scarred, and his left arm hung limply at his side. In the moonlight, Jed saw familiar features. It was Henry Ward. Alive. Yet's anger was replaced by complete shock. "Henry, is that you?" he breathed, not believing his eyes. Ward nodded. His eyes were full of fatigue and pain. "Jed, I thought you were dead," he said softly. The other two men accompanying Ward were none other than the chiefs of Nima's tribe. One of them, old and wise, with long gray hair, rushed to Nima. "She's alive," he whispered with relief. "I thought we were too late." The entire picture changed instantly. Nima, seeing the chiefs, ran to them. These were not the people who had betrayed her, but those who had desperately searched for her. Her eyes, which had recently been burning with fury, filled with tears. It was not just a reunion, it was the regaining of a family, of lost hope. When the dust settled, the story fell into place. Henry Ward was not a traitor. After Jed had presumed him dead, he had been saved by the Comanches. They nursed him back to health, but he lost his arm. The tribal chiefs treated him like a brother, and he, in turn, became their protector. He helped them create a map to hide their treasures, their sacred heritage, from the white settlers. But he had not trusted the right people. Clarence, the reddish-mustached man, was a former scout who had learned about the map and the conspiracy. He and his accomplices, thinking Nima knew the way to the treasures, had kidnapped her to blackmail the chiefs. "They wanted me to tell them where the sacred mountain was," Ward said, his voice full of despair, "but I couldn't. So they grabbed Nima, thinking she would break." Ward's words dispelled all doubts. Yet's anger was now directed at the real culprits, Clarence and his accomplices. They had not just threatened Nima's life, they had threatened an entire tribe. He walked up to Clarence. "You tried to break her. You tried to steal their heritage. Now you will pay for it." Yet's voice was cold and firm. Henry Ward stopped him. "No need to kill, Jed. They've already received their punishment." Behind him stood the two chiefs, their gazes full of wisdom and strength. One of them, Nima's father, came forward and took the pouch with the dog tag and map from Jed. "Your trust was our weakness," he told Ward, "but your loyalty is our strength. Because you remained faithful to us, we will do what must be done." The men who tried to kill Nima were punished by the tribe. They were stripped of their horses, weapons, and provisions, and were told to leave and never return to these lands. It was a punishment that was worse than death. They were left alone with the wild prairie, where they would most likely not survive. It was a harsh, but just, retribution. Jed, Henry, and Nima sat by the fire. Two old friends who had presumed each other dead were now sitting together. Nima, freed from her terrible vow, was happy. She was not property, she was a free woman, part of her people. She looked at Jed, and there was no more pain in her eyes. There was gratitude, admiration, and something new. Something Jed couldn't recognize, but which warmed his heart. "You saved me," she said softly. "Not from death. You saved me from humiliation. From loneliness." Jed nodded. He finally understood that his journey had not ended, but had only just begun. His compassion, his pain, and his anger had brought him here to find a purpose. He had found not only an old friend, but a new life. "Now that you're free," he said, "what will you do?" Nima smiled. "I will rebuild my life," she said. "And you?" "I'll stay," he said, looking into her eyes. I need to help. I need to find my place here." In her eyes, he saw not just a promise, but a real hope. Hope that justice can exist, that friendship can withstand any test, and that even after the darkest period in life, there is always a chance for rebirth. He realized that his journey to the West was not a flight. It was a search, and he had finally found what he was looking for in the eyes of the Comanche woman who had once desperately begged him to save her.